To talk to you about three things this morning, assuming I don't use up all my time talking about completely irrelevant topics. One, that I believe we're at a moment in the evolution of this nation, the United States of America, and of our planet, where we have to have a different type of conversation, and unfortunately one that's become quite unfashionable. So I'd like to talk to you about the merits of being unfashionable. I've been asked to talk a little bit about innovation, and I would enjoy that because I think this is actually necessary to get geodesign from the shiny object, cute toy stage to the it really actually matters to society and civilization and where we're all going. Now, by the way, if you don't do that, I would argue it will happen anyway. So if you all just sit there grinning and have nothing to do with, leaving here inspired by the people you've met and the projects they're doing, and go create in the marketplace to make geodesign happening, it will happen anyway, but it will take longer, and as a result, especially the old farts might miss it. So part of what I want to talk to you today about is you can actually make a really big difference personally in how fast this all happens. And the fact that geodesign is now being talked about, which means people are actually considering it as being a thing, is an important step forward, and that conversation is sustaining. But then the question is, what are you going to do about it? So I'd like to talk about what do you want to do about it? How do you actually make things actionable in a way that can have impact and a difference in the course of human events? And I also put a little list together because I did the first time around. I was asked to do it again. Your new big six. What are the 6 things, if you believe anything I tell you in this talk, that you might want to focus on and think about as how you make them happen to actually do you? To me, this notion of design, design is a great privilege. Excuse me, I have my daughter's latest cold. My daughter is in a preschool where we live, and she is a human petri dish. So she gets and brings to me and sneezes in my face with a big smile. So excuse me if I start dripping during the merits of this. It was actually an interesting thing, this you're getting older thing. When I signed her tuition check to her preschool, best as I can understand, preschool is where they teach them to eat crayons. So I think if you summed up the curriculum, that's basically it. And the check I signed was exactly the same as my tuition to MIT. So when you have those kind of calibratory moments where you're saying, oh, we're not in Kansas anymore. Anyway, stated simply, I think there are only 3 types of design. And everything we see in urban design, architecture, etc., is some combination of those 3 primal first principle forms of design. The first one is what I would call reality-based design, where understanding a sensibility of human beings and what they appreciate, you create things that feel real. You're in a room like this, try to give a sense of openness and air and daylight. You're outside, corridors of trees, green spaces, vistas, the underpinnings of LEED, a whole bunch of other things. How do you create things which are that? That's reality-based design. How do you bring nature into the equation, or how do you exclude it from the equation, depending upon what you're trying to achieve? And that's reality-based design. The next big element of design is fantasy-based design, where you basically say, screw that, I'm doing anything I want, and I want to create worlds and visions and fantasies, and whether it's a theatrical Cirque du Soleil vision, a Disneyland vision of a place to bring your family and share experiences that are positive and create lifelong memories, whether it's a restaurant which creates a romantic ambiance or some combination of other things, fantasy-based design is basically saying reality isn't good enough, I've got a better idea of what could be, and we will cause that set of impressions to happen. And then the third type of design is bad design. Unfortunately, it is the dominant form of design, and everything I've seen is some combination of these sort of 3 primal forces. And as design professionals, I would argue that avoiding bad design might actually be something to hang your hat on as being there, but the problem is doing that in the real world is really, really hard, because most of you don't wake up in the morning and say, let's go design something bad, but you do, as do I. And it's been a long time since people have decided to crawl in out of the rain and find shelter. How many great houses have you seen? Okay, why out of hundreds of millions of houses, all over the place, why are a handful of them great houses? Why are spaces that you're in, such a small number of them, great spaces? Because it turns out it's very hard. And you actually have to come to a series of understandings, and the forces of nature, the forces of government, the forces of a whole bunch of things conspire to maintain the status quo, and the status quo is bad. And so as a result, making things that are fundamentally different or better is difficult. You have to tell a compelling story to get someone to sponsor you. You have to convert code authorities, a whole bunch of other things who basically, you look at things like the Federal Acquisition Regulations, which govern how the Department of Defense buys things. It's encyclopedia-sized volume, and basically anytime someone screwed the government, they made a rule that said you can't do that. It's not any more elegant than that. There's no big idea. It's just, oh, well, we got screwed because someone put the thing on the left rather than the right, so you basically write a thing saying, the requirements will specify that you do this and that, and if you don't, they're in violation, you don't pay them, you send them to jail, you do a bunch of other things. And so that's how most zoning happens. You have preemptive zoning. It says, well, we're not going to allow toilets and accessory structures. Well, if you're an artist, you occasionally pee, and it's actually nice to have a toilet. I live in a city that doesn't allow toilets and accessory structures. Because why? Because the sense is 100 gypsies will move in and establish themselves because of your toilet as the coalescing factor in this artist studio. Preemptive zoning, it's all around. Every building you see in every major city is subject to a whole bunch of those sorts of things. So it doesn't matter that from a civility, sensibility, public health, bunch of other reasons, it's probably a good idea to have a toilet in a little building you're going to spend a lot of time in. You can't have it in the town I live in because of those sorts of things. So there's a lot of that goes on. And the inability of designers who may have great talent in visualization, may have great talent in how do you assemble ideas, of how do you make things that high touch, high tech, any number of things like that, they often don't have the ability to tell the story in a compelling enough way to get enough people lined up to be able to make the miracle, to make the things happen. And so how do we help them? How do we create a set of things which actually helps them tell those stories? And I would argue that that's one of the underpinnings of geodesign. It's telling the story. I would also argue that a set of iterative tools that allows you to do that changes the way you design. The ability to rapidly iterate, the ability, just like you look at film editing. Computers and film editing, I started editing films when you basically had Chems or Steenbecks or Moviolas, and you wanted to change a shot. It took 20 minutes to go find the shot. You cut it too many times, you damaged the film, you had to make a new work print. Every time you make a new work print, you handle the negative, you might screw up the original negative, so there's a lot of pressure, don't do that. So it forced you to be thoughtful. It also precluded you from wanting to experiment a lot, just because there was a price to pay, an opportunity cost for experimentation. The good news and the bad news, computer editing came in overnight, and it changed things. And the good news is you can do 100 different assemblies, do them in minutes, look at the results. The bad news is it was no longer important to be thoughtful because there wasn't a consequence to being unthoughtful. And this sort of question of the consequences of being thoughtful versus not is an important one, especially because many of the fundamental issues facing the future of our planet have very long time constants. And the problem with things with long time constants is we are living in a nation of short attention span people. The kinds of dialogues that happen today, there are people tweeting about this conference right now. You can't tweet more than 140 characters because it was designed not to be able to do that. It is difficult to express a coherent thought in that much time. So as a result, most tweets are not coherent thoughts. And we sort of put it together and we add our own version of coherence. But the problem is where we are heading, especially in the United States of America, and I only speak about that because it's the only country I know really well. I travel a lot, but I know this country reasonably well. And part of the challenge with this short attention span thinking is we are at a stage where I would argue it is impossible to have a sustained public dialogue on a complex subject. And as a result, we don't. And we make decisions based upon hyperbole, on popularity, on public rumor, on bullshit, on a whole collection of other things, but not actually a reasonable public dialogue and debate about a complex topic. Because in a short attention span world, we actually want short, concise, brief, get-to-the-point answers, and without having to... Now, this has been a long trend. You know, you look at the past 100 years, whether it's the invention of the postcard, you know, turn of the century. Someone had to invent it. It's too long to write a letter. Do a postcard. If you make it little, then nobody feels like, you know, the postcard was a tweet. It just happened 100 years ago. And the concept of this tweet was you only make it this big, and yeah, you could write really small, but there's a limit to how small you can write and still see it. So it was a way of basically saying, just get to the point and, you know, tell me you love me or do something like that and send this thing off. There has been, you know, Reader's Digest. Have you heard of it? How many of you read it? Interesting, you'll notice a very few number of hands, probably 10 hands in the room went up. It is the most widely circulated magazine on earth, is Reader's Digest. I have never looked at a Reader's Digest except in a doctor's waiting room. And then I'm afraid to touch it, so I've literally just looked at it. Yet it's vastly popular. Cliff's Notes. Remember Cliff, you know, the 50s, right about the time Cliff's Notes was, well, gee, you're going to school, you have to get a degree. How many of you use Cliff Notes? Oh, a lot more than Reader's Digest. You know, why? Because you had to pass the course, you wanted to learn something, but you certainly wouldn't want to take the time to read that great work of literature or, you know, other thing like that because you don't have time. You got a lot of things to do, and this is the pressure of modern life. Word processing. Again, you know, letter writing and such. When you had to write a letter, and if you made a mistake, you had to either start again or big a X or blot it out. If you had to correct or used carbon, you know, there's a whole bunch of things. So progress and innovation in technology makes the dialogue shorter. Television commercials. Used to be television commercials were 90 seconds or 60 seconds long, the beginning of television. Why? Because the advertisers of the day looked at this fabulous new communications and storytelling medium and said, you can't tell a successful message about selling a product in less than 60 seconds. Now you look at a 60-second spot, it looks like a mini-series because a normal spot is 30 seconds or 15 or 10 or 5. Why? Because our brains have been rewired to accept information faster. The good news is you get a lot more done. The good news is in professions where there's a lot of specialization, you get deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. The bad news is becoming a generalist becomes increasingly impossible because you can't get deep enough in any of the subjects to actually make a contribution other than being an observer. And at the same time, quality of life is deteriorating. That would be all right because you can sort of opt in and out. Actually, you can't. Try not answering your email for a week or a month and watch what happens. Okay? First of all, you go into withdrawal, you're this, that. Second of all, you know, the idea that you're going to get back on email and actually have to look at the 50,000 things that, you know, arrived in the 20 minutes you were off, there is a pressure, and this pressure changes society, it changes the way we think, it has impact, it has a whole collection of other things. The real problem is the big issues facing our nation, urbanization, we saw it before. We got 100 years before oil runs out. The DNA of the automobile hasn't changed in 100 years. What are we actually planning to do about that? Nuclear energy, you know. Group says the best thing since sliced bread. It's the only way that's going to get us through. Another group says, forget it, not there, it's sustainable. These are difficult things. The ozone layer, global warming. These are issues where the consequences of your actions have very long time constants. And as a result, you're not going to see anything really happen based upon the little decisions you're doing here. And in a world of short attention spans, that creates a real problem. Because there is no appetite in political leadership to want to do something unpopular here that will get you not reelected, et cetera, because you're actually affecting something out there. There isn't a great appetite for that. Short attention span nations work on crises, and you go from one crisis to the next, you find the designated victim to blame for the crises, you move on to the next thing. That's where we are now. Why am I bringing this up? Because I think actually geodesign, which to me is a form of storytelling that combines geography, combines the databases of everything that is geotemporally locatable in the world, whether it's events, devices, places, things, and all of that, with modeling and simulation, whether that's real-time or hyper-real-time to be able to look at it, and visualization to be able to look at and tell the stories and examine the consequences of your actions. So that if your models are right and you get people to believe it, and we actually take a moment to get people to understand that science actually has some relevance in this, and that when you want to talk about something like global warming or something like that, there's actually science that matters, and you have to take the time to understand it. And if you're a leader who's going to make a decision in it, you have to take the time to understand the subject, or you have to trust someone who has taken the time to understand the subject, because the dirty little secret in all of this is there are no quick, easy answers to long, complex problems. Or at least we haven't found any of them. And just as any of these new technologies that are introduced into your life, such as email, tweeting, et cetera, adds value to your life and empowers you to do a whole bunch of things, build your social networks, do things that you haven't done before, you pay a price for it. Now, if the price you're paying for it is something that's reversible, meaning I'm just going to stop tweeting or I'm going to do something else, great. If it's something like you burnt the ozone layer off the planet by, clumping it up with chloromethane and, a bunch of other things, well, nobody did that intentionally. And in fact, if one scientist didn't happen to look at this, then we might still not know that it was going on until, well, what is this ozone hole? Why is it happening? The problem is, on these complex topics, why don't we know about it? Because at any given moment in time, the number of people thinking about it might be 0 or 1 or 3 globally. There's just nobody thinking about it. And that's why this empowerment of individuals is actually very, very important, because you may be the one, or one of your kids may be the one, that gets around to noticing something that nobody else noticed, because the time constants are so long, you don't even see signs of it for 20 or 30 years. Once you've seen signs of it, it might be irreversible, or you might be able to just catch it, or there's a price you're going to have to pay, which is a big price to turn the thing around or do something else. So that's why geodesign matters. I would argue that this ability to look into the future, show people the future, have it influence your design process because you can rapidly iterate and look at alternatives, it changes the way you design. And not only does it change the way you design, but it changes the way you execute design, because ultimately it lets you tell the story in a way, assuming you take the time to learn the subject, build the credibility, validate the models, a whole bunch of things. Nothing worse than modeling and simulation, where basically it gives you the correct answer to the wrong question. And we see a lot of that going on. But basically, once you get it right, this becomes an enabler. And why does it become an enabler? Because one of you in this room was qualified to get the model right. You got the model right, that knowledge shared across all of your geodesign platforms, just like the network effect of the smart cars. So that bit of insight and knowledge didn't have to be recreated again everywhere. It's shared everywhere. And then, by the way, that plus an insight of yours and an insight of yours ends up being really relevant for a problem none of you ever heard about or understood, but this person does, and because it's on the network, they are able to understand that and put it together, and in fact, an entire community can form around that whole new subject area, and I would argue that's the power of geodesign. It's this networked extension of shared intelligence where basically the insights of individuals can be shared among others, and that can be used as the foundation to build upon it. So it's nice to say we'll build better cities, we'll understand transportation, the toxic waste plume, we can model all of that, but I would argue getting it right, just as the Apple Store and this notion of apps and this notion of wireless mobility has totally transformed how we think about mobile communications, et cetera, and by definition, transforming the way we think about our planet and education and transportation and commerce and a whole bunch of other things like that. On one level, it's doing that. On the other level, it's introducing the option for cyber terrorism and cyber warfare and a whole collection of other things. With any of these innovations come corresponding problems. The time constants are such that you're constantly going back and forth between the yins and the yangs of it, understanding the consequences. I mean, I was there when the internet was getting started. And, I had email when I was at MIT in 1970, but we weren't thinking now about how my kid, 40 years in the future is going to be learning on one level about her world and building friendships, et cetera, and learning about ballet and a whole bunch of other things that she learned all by herself, because all I am is a better version of Siri. She tells me what she's interested in, I do data entry, thank you, Daddy, she takes it away, and, she's perfectly happy. I wouldn't have thought about the enablement and what happens when this is how they've grown up in a networked world and understanding it. I also wouldn't have thought about predators and folks like that who can be out there wanting to do her harm, and how am I going to protect her from that? It's a very difficult set of challenges that you balance, but the answer is not to remain stationary and don't embrace it. What geodesign is going to do is, on one level, I believe, be the greatest gift for humanity that we have ever experienced. It is going to be the underpinning, just as the internet, I believe, is the most important technological advance since language. Far more important than reading and writing. I've said in the past, I think reading and writing gets 250 years. It's a fad, it's over, unnecessary, replaced by something else. Storytelling is fundamental. I think we're wired to be able to do that. But reading and writing, poof, it'll be gone. Right now, you have, do you know how many people there are in the world? 7 billion. Do you know how many working cell phones there are in the world? And we know exactly how many there are because someone's paying for each and every one of them. You know how many? 6 billion. Okay? Now, she has 4 of them, so it does skew the number slightly, et cetera. But there's something very fundamental and important going on, and the empowerment that ideas like geodesign have, just as the founders of the internet understood this is about connecting everyone on Earth, and understood that, and came up with the architectures of IP and a collection of other things to be intrinsically scalable, so that even though at a time it was done there were a few hundred computers in the world, we could actually now anticipate billions of computers in the world, and it was scalable, and you can actually change the architecture as we're doing, IPv6, so that we extend the space of address so that it's scalable, et cetera. Scalable solutions that are important. So, what do you do about this? How do you actually move forward? You're designers, you're design professionals, you're other folks in that. What's it take to get this stuff done? And, I was interested. I was on the Army Science Board a long time ago, and they commissioned a study on future leaders. And this was when scenario planning was popular, so you basically pick 2 axes you think are important. It could be sales and cost of goods. And you basically look at this quad chart to see what are your possible futures. Why? Because it means if one of these futures starts happening, at least you've gone through the intellectual exercise of understanding what it might be about and how. And the 2 axes, because the Army is really good at measuring things, okay? So they have things, and I know your intelligence, your NSEAM, how long it takes you to answer a question, how fast everything about you is measured and recorded. And the 2 things they thought important for leadership was intelligence. So they started with intelligence and basically said, okay, one of you is the smartest, one of you is in the dumbest. So just like this, we could measure this. You pick a metric. One of you in this room is the dumbest. One of you is the smartest. And we could, plot a distribution of you there. Is it a bell curve? Is it skewed? Hard to know. And the other was motivation. So basically, they went from the laziest person, over here to the most energetic person over here, because it seemed for the Army these were 2 reasonably good metrics what happened. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you picked in this room the dumbest, laziest person, there is one of you here. And one of you met them at the beginning of this session. Probably, if you're looking for the global leader of tomorrow to make the vision of our new cities and world and planet and sustainability and the things we all would agree are important, you don't start with the laziest, dumbest person in the room. Okay? The interesting thing is, it's not the worst. It turns out if you pick the dumbest and most energetic person in the room, this can actually be a lot worse. How many of you have been in organizations run by a dumb, energetic person? Okay, I rest my case. And it also turns out, perhaps paradoxically, that the best leaders don't come from here, smart and energetic. Why? Because these people are a huge pain in the ass. They can do everything better than everybody else in the organization is. They're always right. They're this, and this kind of thing. And, basically just kind of annoying to work for these people because, yes, they may be visionary and great leaders and all that, but, give it a rest, okay? This is just that. It turns out that the best organizational leaders in the Army came from this: people who are smart and kind of lazy. Why? Because they build self-correcting systems. So they build teams, they provide leadership, they give guidance. They want to stay at the golf course, okay? They want to relax and know everything's working fine, and any potential problem that can happen, the self-correcting process with the teams who have been empowered corrects itself. So it turns out smart, lazy people actually make the most effective leaders in that situation. Problem is, what do you do with this information? Recruit smart, lazy people? Then you have an organization where everybody phones it in, and pretty soon there's just nobody to actually do real work. So the problem is, looking at these issues, understanding these issues, is not really good enough. You actually have to have a construct that allows you to be thoughtful, allows you to generate communities of talent that come around and provide a vision that's self-correcting that puts them there. It's a different way of creating a market. It's a way of creating an intellectual market within your organization that has the power and the ability to be definitionally better than you as the leader are. If you do it right, just as the App Store model caused the products of Apple to be better than anything at Apple could be designed internally. Because why? You got everything that's designed in Apple internally, plus you have the added-on layers of all the apps being designed by clever, interesting people on top of it. This has got to be better than just this or just that. So that ability to combine things. So the problem is, and this is the unpopular part of the discussion, is if we're going to address these big global issues facing us, and whether that's disease, whether it's education, whether it's fresh water, whether it's war, you name it. There's this whole list of really big issues that we have to deal with, global warming, et cetera, et cetera. If you're going to get that done, you actually have to take a long view. Right now, organizations develop a plan. How many of your organizations have a 5-year plan? Okay? Common. How many of you have ever thought seriously farther than 18 months into your 5-year plan? Not one hand, okay? That's what spreadsheets were made for. You punch it in an Excel, you have reasonable growth expectations, outcomes, et cetera. It runs the numbers, say, yeah, that looks good. Oh, no, that looks like we're being too ambitious. Dial it down a little, this does this. But nobody thinks in a next quarter, short attention span business environment, if you're thinking out 18 months, you're doing well. And many people are thinking next quarter or 20 minutes in theory, or 5 minutes into the future. And so the problem is, I would argue, that we actually need to start a different type of dialogue. And for this planet, we need, pick a number, a 250-year plan. Just as we need a 250-year plan for the country and a 250-year plan for geodesign. Borrowing from the military that thinks about modern warfare differently. Old days, they used to think about attrition. You beat the enemy senseless until they stopped fighting you. That was the basis of war. We've now switched to something which we think is a new idea. Sun Tzu probably thought it was a new idea a few thousand years ago. But it's called effects-based warfare, where you basically start with an interesting premise, which is, what is my current state? State of affairs are the topic you're worried about. What is your desired end state? And then how are you going to get there? And I think that's actually a quite good way to think about our planet and about global extinction and about a whole bunch of things. Here we are now. If we pay attention, we know where we are now. We can actually take a census, understand where we are, the statistics and all of that. Let's look forward 250 years. Where do we want to be then? Now, we know a bunch of things will happen. We'll run out of oil. We'll do this. Yeah, we'll find more. We'll run out of it again. We'll do a whole bunch of things. So there's not going to be this. There's not going to be that. There's going to be a collection of things. Where do you want to be in 250 years? What's the end state? I would argue that having the discipline to just sit down for a day and think about that will change your whole thought process. If you get it right, it doesn't mean you're going to know exactly what the future is any more than in scenario planning you know exactly what the outcomes are, but having a sense that it's over there and having a sense that in 250 years you'd like to address these things at least gives you an intellectual template and a roadmap to test your ideas against. It also gives you a way of having a different type of conversation, saying that, well, on one level, there's the time and pressure of the near term, the midterm and the near term, the projects you have to deliver, the things you're being gauged upon. Right now, most of us don't have a metric to gauge that against the long-term end state that we would like to end up in. So it might turn out to be a great idea, it might not, but I would argue having a 250-year plan enabled by geodesign would give one a framework, give our leaders a framework, give our urban planners a framework, give our architects, our zoning people a framework to say, you know, people have been thinking about this. People continue to think about it. That same network effect in geodesign, the more work people do on the long-term plan, the more that body of knowledge increases that becomes the template that other people can build and learn from. And pretty soon you're on the path to doing something, I would argue, that could be really important, which is provide an intellectual and creative framework for the design communities to use in what is the end state that we are trying for. Now, will you get it wrong? Of course you'll get it wrong. So by definition, you need to incorporate the notion of agility and flexibility into this 250-year plan so that as you get something wrong, you can react to it easily and quickly and be able to come up with, frankly, a better idea and say, oops, we got this wrong, we have new information, plug it into the model changes, we now understand there's something we actually missed. That's the power of distributed network simulations and such. Once you figure out what it is, it also means that people with wild ideas can plug it into the model and everybody can learn from that. And when I say plug it into the model, it means, gee, I have a model of how trees grow and how people move and how cities sprawl and how the rain moves, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is you can create a vision of the future and get to see, will it happen? Will it not? What did you get wrong? What did you get right? I would argue the very act of doing that, building these models, will show you things you never thought about. And you didn't realize the effects of this because you have to think about not just the first order effect of what you design, if you're talking about designing cities and worlds in our future, but the second, third, and nth order effects, which are often not obvious at the time you do it, and sometimes takes time. You have to go live with it, you got to see what, the people who designed the projects didn't think they were building ghettos. They thought they were building something which was an efficient process in urbanization to do something. It's just they didn't understand a set of social dynamics of how people in cities would behave. And so now that we do, you say, okay, well, we understand this tends to happen. It doesn't mean you can't have an innovative idea where you think you can reinvent the project and do it in a way that's fundamentally better and superior. Great, plug it in, try it out. If it doesn't work in the model and you're a good enough storyteller, get someone to sponsor you doing it, and then we all get to see. That's part of this ongoing experiment that the design is about. So I'm running late on time. The organizations that you have to build to do this, it's important that you understand the people in your organization and your customers. And the people in your organization are like you. Why? Because if you built your organization, you hired the people you like, and you didn't hire the people you don't like. And if you were hired, it's because they hired you because you're like them and you didn't. And we talk about how we love and embrace change. We don't. Nobody likes change. It's annoying. It's disruptive. We talk about how innovation is essential. It isn't. It's mainly just a big pain in the ass, and most people don't like it and don't want to have anything to do with it. Every company on earth says you have to get out of the box. What they mean is we need a new box, and I want to, as quickly as possible, get you from the old box into the new box. But importantly, this notion of how do you build organizations that do this, I would argue there really are two types of people in the world who build organizations in their own image. The two types of people, I guess, people who believe there are two types of people in the world and people who don't would be one of them. So, there's this sort of thing, but I digress. The first type is what I would call a requirements person. And a requirements person believes in a generally quite quantitative process to how you get the business of design done. You put together a team, you empower this team. Okay? What does empowering mean? No one knows, but you can't have a team that isn't empowered and expect them to be effective, so you sprinkle water on them and you empower them. In my case, Diet Coke, and go forth. You give them terms of reference, etc. Any well-empowered requirements-based team believes that in order to be effective, you have to be measured, so they will agree on a set of metrics, because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, etc., etc. They are encouraged to go off and speak to the customer because they are admonished that they never speak to the customer. Go find that. Look at best practice, see what they're doing in Bolivia. Go around and look at all of the great projects and come up with, a vision. Express the vision to me in a PowerPoint deck called the preliminary requirements document. You do that. You put it together, you submit it to senior management, and it's based upon questioning the customer, research and development, prototyping, a whole bunch of due diligence that you do for it, good economic modeling, etc. It is immediately rejected, faster than the speed of light, in fact. Is it rejected? Why? Because it's too expensive and it's going to take too long. So you start a process called value engineering, which means go back to the customer and tell them, I know you said you have to have all these things, but it's going to take too long, you can't afford it, what can you live with? The integrated process team, IPT, that's been put together to do this project, one by one people are leaving. This is boring, nobody's taking it seriously. Finally, you're down to the last 2 people at ASRI responsible for this grand vision, and they're spending most of their time looking for the tallest building in Redlands to throw themselves from in order to, in protest to, the fact that the grand vision for geodesign and how we're going to productize this is not going to happen. As if by magic, it gets approved. Why? Well, it's interesting, because actually no one has ever seen the moment of approval in a requirements-based organization. Why? Because nobody in a requirements-based organization has a yes vote, but everybody has a no vote. So the only reason something happens is someone forgot to say no. Somewhere in the organization, they forgot to say no. The door slammed shut, it blew from the in basket into the out basket. There was a photograph taken once of this process happening. Some people think it was photoshopped, but nonetheless, we don't know how projects are approved, but it happens. In which case, the work product from the IPT is tossed over to the transom to some group of people whose job it is to execute. They say, what is this piece of crap? We tried this 3 times. It's never worked in the past. Nothing you're saying is any new. It's not going to work in the future. We say, what are you talking about? You were part of the IPT that made this. They say, we never put our good people on the IPTs. They've got real work to do, so we disavow all knowledge of this thing, but we'll build it anyway. They build it, time goes on, it gets tossed over another transom to the customer, who says, what the hell is this? This has nothing to do with anything we talked about. It's not even recognizable, but we'll try it. They try it, one of 2 things happens. Either it's a huge success, in which case everybody basks in the reflected glory of a well-executed requirements program, and life moves on, people are promoted, life is good. And understand, in these organizations where nobody can say yes, no, a behavioral model is that you are never rewarded for success, but you are always punished for failure. And you wonder why in government organizations that you're working with to get things done, that the bureaucrats you're working with don't love your great new plan. It's because if anything goes wrong with your plan, they will be punished and a career ender. And if your plan goes right, they will get no credit for it, you will get credit for it. So all you're doing is driving up risk and cost and a whole bunch of other things, which is why it's in their DNA not to approve your grand plan for the new city. Anyway, does that process sound familiar to any of you? I'm sure none of you have experienced it. But I'm here to tell you there's a fundamentally different process, which I would call the big idea process, as compared to the requirements process. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. But in big idea organizations, you never have teams. You basically have visionaries. You have people who are anointed as being the visionary du jour because they had something that was a success. Motion picture business, star architects, other folks like that. The person is a superstar because they did something really great, they were acknowledged for it. We trust that they'll find a way to pull this whole thing together. You never talk to the customer, because the sense is the customer will only give you a mild incremental improvement, if that, on what you already have. You want to invent the smartphone, go to a BlackBerry user and say, what would you do to make the phone of the future? How many of them do you think would say, get rid of all the buttons, make the screen 3 times the size, get me half the battery life, make the battery not interchangeable, create an app store, and give me multi-touch? Okay? How many BlackBerry users do you think, how many groups of users would ever come up with that? And the answer is, none of them would. And in fact, most of the people that resisted switching over to iPhones or the next generation smartphones, it's because everything about it ran against their grain, and everything they loved about their device, we took away. Now, why do they change? Because they don't have a choice, because, they die. There's a whole bunch of things that happen that basically do that. They're embarrassed by their girlfriends or children or other things into, what are you doing with that diesel, phone? You basically wear them out, is why people change, while there's a whole other community that embraces it. I'd urge you to read Clay Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, talking about in companies, how companies keep going to the fancier, higher margin things because the people come in from the bottom and take the commodity businesses, which they don't want anyway because there's no margin, and then someone comes in and takes theirs, and they keep going. Problem is, as you go up this food chain, because here's where you get the margin, where you can actually make money, the size of the market keeps going down, till eventually you have no market. You can't move down the food chain because your cost of business is up, and you go poof. And that's what's happening. Look at Eastman Kodaks, look at the General Motors, look at the companies that have been there. Can they survive these near-death experiences? Sometimes. Polaroid didn't. A whole bunch of them haven't. There are almost no companies that are more than 100 years old. Time constants. Why? Because it's hard to be more than 100 years old, because everything that made you great is the thing that prevents you from being different in this innovative new world. So, what's the point? Big idea organizations, they look at the world entirely differently. They have a team. The job of the team is to get the vision of the Grand Fromage to happen. The guy or gal who's the director, you're working on a Steven Spielberg movie, you're a 3-time Academy Award, director of photography, musician, et cetera, you're not there to do your movie, you're there to do Steven Spielberg's movie. And your job is to use your creative talent to make it better, and if you're the director of photography, make it beautiful. If you're the set designer, make it beautiful. And any of you get run over by a truck, the union will have replacement there that afternoon. They'll look at the dailies, and they'll keep shooting, and life will be good. And it goes on. And, every so often people say, because it's a hit-driven business, and a bunch of things will flop, but all it takes is one hit. 1 out of 10 films, the movie studio, it works. The rest of them are going to be dogs, it doesn't happen. So how do you do this then? How do you put things together? Because the grown-ups say, wait a minute, why don't you go some due diligence? Go find out what are the highest-grossing films of all time. Find out what they've got. And then, by the way, let's go pick the actors that were in the highest grossing films of all time. Get me some of those, let's put it together, put a requirements document together, and let's make a movie, okay? So that's why people design our cities. Let's put the requirements together for the city, we'll do a design charrette, we'll put the whole thing together, here's what matters, overlay it with all the rules. Okay, so your answer would be Leonardo DiCaprio, a dinosaur or some blue guy, in a thing, and a boat. Okay? Highest grossing films, those are the things. We got it, boss. Here's the big 3. We're ready to go. And all of a sudden, look back and say, what are you kidding me? This is going to cost too much. We'll never get this. Take too long, etc. Great. You value engineer it. We'll get rid of the blue guy. We'll get DiCaprio on a boat. What kind of movie do you want to make? Ask the audience. Well, you ask the audience, and they generally say, don't look at us. We're not the professionals. You're the creative people. But I can tell you the one thing. We love surprise endings. Okay? Everyone you ask about what your favorite kind of movie is, surprise ending is very high on the list. How many of you like surprise endings? Right? Good? Right, okay. Would you do Titanic? I mean, you knew the ending, right? The boat's going to sink. Anyone walk in to see Titanic that didn't expect at some point in the damn movie the boat's going to sink, okay? It's a given. The reality is, you don't make the great movies, you don't make anything based upon a bunch of requirements. A bunch of requirements, asking the audience, doing all of that, following rules, playing by the rules, might get you a little run and extension. You had something that's really popular here, you could have version 2, version 3, version 11, etc. Pretty soon you run out. You want innovation, you need big ideas. Big ideas come from individuals, not teams, of people who can inspire people, terrorize people, some combination of things to bring their force of will to bear to get their ideas and visions to happen. Some of you in this room are those visionaries, and GeoDesign to you will be an empowerment tool that allows the people who are there to help you move forward. You realize you're not going to succeed without them helping you, and so you play by the rules in order to get that to happen. If you're not one of those creative people who's going to be the thing, go find one, because they're a very powerful force to get the big ideas that have changed our world to happen. Architecture is full of them, urban planning, a whole bunch of things. Someone just has an idea. Everyone says it's impossible, it'll never happen. They make everybody's life miserable, put their life, their reputation, their finances, their family on the line to get the thing to happen, because that's how these people work. So what's the problem? Let's just get a few of each. We'll put together the 250-year plan, and we can move out. Problem is, these people, the requirements people, who build most of our world, the big idea people who develop the ideas, hate each other. Okay? So requirements people, big idea people, the requirements people think the big idea people are undisciplined babies, irresponsible, completely disruptive to how the organization works, and simply shouldn't be tolerated. Okay? Suffice to say, the big idea people think the requirements people drain the life force out of the room. They don't even have to say a word. Their mere presence precludes the possibility of a creative outcome. Problem is, if you, the future designers of our cities and our world, don't solve this problem and get those two groups to play well together, you cannot build cities without requirements people. It will not happen. Those are the people that run the world, run the government, and run the things that you need to get a yes from. Doesn't matter if you're on time, on budget, you design something really bad and awful, and it will never be better than really bad and awful, and you're not going to get there by filling out the requirements. There's a common misconception in requirements organizations that simply having the right requirements gives you the correct outcome, or a creative outcome, or an innovative outcome. There is no evidence to suggest that's true. I know of no example of a requirements process that has ever yielded a creative or innovative output because it's not what it does. Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because sometimes you need real innovation, which is what we need in our society and our planet right now. We had a pretty good run without requiring innovation. I said before, innovation is really annoying. If you manufacture penicillin, do you want innovation? Do you want everyone in the company leaving their personal imprint on the molecular structure of your drug? Probably not. You want every little drug to be just the same as the one that was approved by the FDA. Designing our cities is much like that. You build buildings, you want them to be just the same as the others. They want to be safe, they want to be this, they want to be that. The fact is, the end state is never where you want to be. That's the course we're on now, and we've got to fix it. I'm looking at you to fix it. And I think the big principles that you have to look at in this are, first of all, understanding big ideas are not new to the United States. Bill of Rights, remember that? Pretty big set of ideas. You could argue it was the 250-year plan. It was done about 250 years ago. It's working just as well now as it did the day that it's authored, and it created, much like the smart and lazy speaker, it created a self-correcting mechanism to run this nation by, and created, incidentally, a global, a world market for freedom of rights, independence, a whole bunch of things which other people built their constitution and other elements on. It was a very powerful fundamental idea. It is an algorithm. It is a thing which allows you to go back and look at it. It can be debated. It has some ideas that were strong, some that were weaker, some that have to be contemporized, as we're looking at with gun control and a whole collection of things due to the changes in behaviors of society and consequences that take a long time constant to figure out, but it was an important idea. So I think you need to design the Bill of Rights for our planet, and I think you need to use geodesign to do it. I think you have to come up with a fairly simple set of principles that 250 years from now, when people look back, you're going to say, gee, that was a remarkable document that those people put together, just as Bill of Rights was, because it provided a self-correcting process that became more and more relevant as time went on. Why? Because the Bill of Rights doesn't talk about why it's illegal to park your horse out in front of the Capitol building overnight. Okay? That's how urban planning rules, it's none of that. It basically says, here's what's important to human beings. Because the thing to keep in mind is, rules of thumb like Moore's law tell us that every 18 months, the number of transistors, which we can equate to the processing power of a computer, is going to double at constant cost, or the cost is going to drop in half for constant computing power. It's worked for 30 years, it's going to continue to work. You know how much computing power you're going to have and have available. Farron's law is that human beings in our cities and our planet isn't governed by Moore's law. And the time constants of how people change and societies change and cultures change on the macro level takes a very long time. And we care about the same things we've always cared about, which are love, companionship, our families, food, shelter, safety, those fundamental things. And that's what you need to do when building the Bill of Rights for our planet. I would argue that geodesign is the organizing principle and what will become the toolkit that allows you, first of all, to do that, to create the marketplace for sharing the intellectual and creative ideas, to provide the platforms that the innovators can test their ideas against, and at the same time to provide a path forward so the near-term projects, which is what all of us as design professionals are involved with on a daily basis, can be judged against some goal and roadmap for the greater good. I think if I had to give you your big six, it's in the midst of the chaos that comprises most of our modern life and contemporary design process, encourage taking time to have a long-term plan and spend a little bit of your life with some time reserved to think in the long term. 2, be brave and willing to take on hard long-term problems, even though it's unfashionable, and all of the forces of nature and of the design world and the practices you're working in are going to punish you rather than reward you for that. There is an opportunity cost. It will not happen if you just allow things to run their course. Use science combined with engineering and design to rise above the rhetoric, to start and sustain a public dialogue, emphasis public dialogue, on the topics that really matter, so that we can actually have a debate and a discussion. And if the people are being asked to make sacrifices, which they will, people will make sacrifices from their worldview of where they are now in order to make the future happen. They're not going to do that unless you've taken the time to tell the story in a compelling way where they realize why it's worth making a sacrifice. You talk to anyone who's a parent, and they will make a sacrifice. Can I have the slide, please? One slide I brought you. That's my daughter Kira with the gang she runs. And, you know, that's what we're doing all of this for. We have to protect the people who don't have the power to protect themselves. We have to protect the species that don't have the power to protect themselves. We have to work against the self-interest groups that may in fact not align with a long-term plan that's beneficial. Why? Because a different set of mechanisms run that. Corporations that exist as a multinational corporation to maximize the profits to their investors. A person running that in the United States goes to jail if they don't take seriously running to maximize the profits for their investors. Nowhere is there a Bill of Rights for the planet that someone says, but by the way, it's okay if you pay attention to these things that matter. There needs to be, because otherwise, I would argue, the forces of nature that cause one set of entities to be successful will by definition suppress another set of entities. Some of those entities need to be protected from suppression. Some, by the way, should just go away. And it's just fine. There are a whole bunch of things where, not everything should be preserved in our planet, and we have to understand that. I think we have to create aspirational role models so kids like my daughter have people to look up to say, I want to be like that when I grow up. And the role models can't just be musicians, and can't just be drug dealers in the inner city, and can't just be celebrities. They have to have people who have had an impact on our world. One of the things geodesign can do is help elevate the presence of those people, so we create role models so that we actually have the feedstock intellectually and creatively in the geodesign community necessary to take it to these next stages. Because if you can't attract the best and the brightest, you're done. They're going to move somewhere else, and this stuff is not going to happen the way it ought to. I think you have to lead by geodesign. I think you have to use it as a tool to educate our educators, to educate our politicians, to educate our political and media leadership so that they understand the consequences of our action, but rather than just say, this is all doom and gloom, so you might as well just stay home and kill yourself, that actually, here's something we can do about this. You have to be, on one level, realistic about understanding the science and the mechanisms of what's really happening. On the other end, you have to be proactive and positive about how are we going to get our way out of this. Because nobody's interested in hearing more bad news. You want to pick what's wrong with our country at the moment? Everything you hear is bad news. In order to have good news, you have to, I would argue, have this aspirational end state, which is understandable and with hard work achievable, because everyone I know who has a family will make enormous sacrifices for their family. We do all of this for our kids. That's why you need to do geodesign. It's for our kids. It's not for anything else. It's giving the world back in a slightly better way than the way we found it. To do this, I would argue as geodesigners, you are going to be entrusted, the geodesigners of the future, with the same power over life and death that our doctors have, just with a longer time constant, okay? So they make a mistake, your surgeon makes a mistake, and you hear those words you'd really not like to hear, oops, not good. The mistakes you make in planning and designing our cities may take 100 years until someone understands the consequences of those actions. Hippocratic oath for geodesign. First, do no harm. really sort of understand what you're doing and the effect, and that, by the way, you're going to take chances, you're going to do things, but if you know this is going to create long-term harm and damage, it is not okay to do it, even though you're being paid to do it, and there's a lot of pressure that says you should do it. It's not okay. You need to have a long-term vision. I'm recommending 250 years, but something that is a living document that is the expression of the best, brightest, and most creative people thinking about this subject in a way that is comprehensible to others. The others who make decisions and the others who have to live by those decisions, called our people. And the species who don't happen to be people, but are also living inhabitants of this planet, who we have the custodianship over. We have the power to make them go away. We have the power to protect them. It is our obligation to life to protect them. Consider the second, third, and nth order effects of what we create. Not in a way that it paralyzes you, because you can get into this analysis paralysis mode where we're going to study this for the next 100 years. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm saying is, understand the consequences of what you're doing, but you have to think more about what you're doing than did you check off all the boxes. Gee, I've got a LAID, super palladium platinum rating, I've got this, I've got a whole bunch of other things. But the net result is the city will have no water in 50 years, and therefore maybe this isn't actually the right place to go build this new city. And you have to think about that. And finally, I would take your charge seriously as the custodians of our planet, and that storytelling is the most powerful tool you have to send the messages of your insights forward. We're not on this earth very long. It's a mere blip. You look at the history of our planet. Try to leave it a little better than how we found it. Just that's part of the profession. Your job is to really just, at the end of the day, the place is a little better than when you found it. And if we all do that, if we take the time to be thoughtful, if we work to build consensus, because on one level, you have the paradox of the great visionaries don't actually want to listen to anyone. It's just their plan they want to execute. At the same time, nobody's going to let them do it if it's going to be on a global scale without building a consensus. So you got to build it. And you, Mr. or Miss Visionary over here, have to realize your vision is never going to happen unless you build the sort of consensus necessary to make it happen. And you, the people who are going to go build it, have got to realize it doesn't matter what your budget schedule and time is. If it turned out to be a bad idea, you're going to fail. And as a result, you're going to fail in the domain we're talking about. We're going to fail. Our planet's going to fail. Our society is going to fail. I've taken far too much time. Really appreciate the opportunity to get back to talk to you. But please don't do this for me. Do it for her. Thanks.